Fantastic. Thanks for that, Izzy. So yes, as some of you are probably aware, we had an ETH slashing incident almost 2 weeks ago now on the 11th of October. And as Izzy said, I kind of wanted to run through what caused that, what our architecture looks like, and how we've improved, and also some of the learnings and key actions that have come out of the incident. So in summary, 20 of the validators that we manage were slashed on the 11th of October. And primarily that was because we had duplication of validator keys in 2 different clusters. So we had a primary data center 1, and a failover data center 2. And in essence, we had intermittent connectivity in DC1. And so we decided to switch over to DC2, but the way we did that wasn't optimal, and that resulted in the slashing, essentially. We noted the slashing within 5 minutes of the first event, essentially, and both our internal monitoring and Lido's monitoring flagged us to that. We rapidly took our clusters offline, and then separately after the kind of slashing was identified and we shut down our infrastructure, we destroyed the DC1 servers and the separate Web3 signer that we were using, and we very carefully, cautiously, over the next 8 hours or so, brought up our second infrastructure with small batches of validators, and I'll talk that through as well. And the following day, really, on the October the 13th, we kind of finalised the root cause analysis, and the post-mortem was published in the forums. So this is a super high level. I recognise this isn't a beautiful network topology, but it's a very kind of simplistic view of our infrastructure. And as LaunchNodes, we run nodes across multiple different environments. We've got some in each of the main cloud providers, but we also focus quite heavily on bare metal, especially for Lido, and especially in kind of geographically diverse regions. So we have a bare metal data center, DC1, which has Kubes clusters and execution layer and consensus layer nodes running, with some local storage, which is shown by the orange storage icon here. We also have a data center 3, which is separate to the other 2, where we have a remote Web3 signer. And in essence, the reason we've architected our system like that is if we ever lost connectivity to data center 1 or data center 2, we can kill the Web3 signer and effectively stop all our nodes and stop any issues with them. But as you can see, there are 2 red arrows here, which should never have been the case, because when we did fail over to DC2, we found that both the Web3 signer was serving keys to both DC2 and DC1 simultaneously, which shouldn't have happened. And on the afternoon of the event, the actual situation was we lost some connectivity to DC1 throughout the afternoon. We were getting intermittent connectivity, and then we lost access to our Kubernetes clusters via the VPC connection, which is managed by the data center provider. So we were trying to get support from the data center provider. We were trying to get access to our validator nodes. We could get onto the servers themselves, but not actually touch our validators. So when we were having latency issues and connectivity issues, we were kind of flying blind somewhat and somewhat unable to manage that infrastructure. So what we did at the time was a fairly unorthodox way of trying to stop the validators, which is effectively moving the storage that's attached to the Besu service. So the orange storage there, we moved the path of it so that the Besu service couldn't actually access it. We've done that in the past, and it means that the EL-CL pair doesn't function because it can't synchronize with the latest head. And we assumed, therefore, that those nodes were down. We checked our monitoring, and we checked external monitoring, and they said our nodes weren't attesting. So we kind of were confident that that infrastructure was down. We failed over to DC2, and then realized that DC1 was still actually up and that essentially caused the slashing event. So let me move on from there. What would have prevented this? So very simply, it's all down to that assumption that the DC1 node cluster was down. If we'd have nuked that node cluster, rather than assume it was down because monitoring said it was down and we thought we'd moved the storage, then we wouldn't have had this issue. And equally, if we'd have killed the Web3 signer, so the one shown here on DC3, and built the Web3 signer in DC2 as we eventually did, then again we wouldn't have had this issue. So fundamentally, the assumption there was wrong. The process could have been smoother. So that's a lesson, and that's been rectified, as you'll see. So there is a really thorough kind of play-by-play on the Ethereum in the Lido forums, showing the post-mortem, showing the incident report and the write-up from both Lido and ourselves. But I wanted to show here some of the kind of key activities that went on through October the 11th afternoon through to the morning and day of October the 12th. Some of this I've talked through, so I'll be fairly rapid with it. But essentially, we were seeing connectivity issues. We realized we couldn't connect to the Cubes clusters. The external connectivity remained up, so we were getting missed attestations and then valid attestations happening. We tried to effectively kill DC1 nodes from being active by moving the server, as I say. Our suspicion and belief now is that move never didn't complete successfully, and so Besu continued to operate as it was. And then, as I say, we kind of got our cold backup site ready for switchover, and we practice these switchovers on a regular basis. So this isn't new stuff to us. I think the different piece here was that we couldn't access the nodes and we couldn't verify that the node services were down. So we made a couple of fatal assumptions, which clearly we shouldn't have done. We started the switch over to DC2 at 15:45 UTC, and DC2 we decided to use the existing Web3 signer because we thought it wasn't in use for DC1, and therefore, to save time, we just wanted to use that with our other node infrastructure. We brought the node clusters online at DC2, and then at 15:55, 10 minutes later, we realized that slashing was happening. We deactivated all our nodes within about 10 minutes, and we jumped on a call with Lido and started the root cause analysis and planning what to do next. We reset our keys a couple of hours later, our vetted keys, so that we wouldn't be allocated further stake. And we drew up a fairly comprehensive restore service, which we reviewed with Lido's DAO community. And then in very small batches, so initially 10, then 100, then 500, we brought the nodes back online, removing the keys for the slash validators, obviously, and monitoring at every stage. So we watched and monitored, make sure okay, and then did the next batch, and that was a lengthy process. As you can see from the second box here, we can spin up nodes, 4,000 nodes in minutes if we need to, but actually in this instance, doing it very carefully and making sure that there are no errors was absolutely crucial. And the other key piece here is making sure that the Web3 signer used is configured with slashing protection, which is now the case across our infrastructure. The next morning on October the 12th, we met to review the impact, so looking at what had resulted from that, and then on an ongoing basis through October the 12th was reviewing our infrastructure and optimization and planning to revert back to DC1, which is where we are now. And if I move on from there, the kind of key action items were enabling the Web3 signer slashing database, which has been done. We did that within hours of this incident. Actually during the incident, you could say. We have a pretty clear plan for restoring the bare metal infrastructure. We're kind of fine-tuning that. One of the key things that we don't want, what we're trying to do across our infrastructure is engineer out any bottlenecks or any points of failure or any dependencies on third-party providers, and that's quite challenging, especially in remote regions of the world. So some of our nodes are in Asia, some of our nodes are in Africa, and we've got good data center providers and we've got good connectivity in general. But if you've got to wait for support or firewall rule changes or other things, that can slow you down and cause issues. So we're trying to engineer that out by using other approaches rather than the VPC connections. We've shared some of that so far with the Lido DAO community. We plan to share more and have that reviewed pretty thoroughly. We're also going through the process of having our whole architecture reviewed and kind of vetted. And the next plan, once we've tested pretty thoroughly, both on testnet and on our staging and production servers, is to shut down that DC2 infrastructure and bring up the validators. So a couple of key learnings, or relearnings, I should say, because none of this stuff really is new. We all know that slashing A is pretty understandable, and B is relatively straightforward to solve with some basic things in place. So we're very cognizant of that. The first point is really, if you come from a networking background or a finance background or anything, availability is absolutely crucial. But actually, zero slashing trumps availability every time. Rule number one of Lido is don't slash, and rule number two is probably refer back to rule number one. Making assumptions, assuming that nodes are down, never do that. Always nuke your infrastructure and rebuild it, rather than assume that your nodes are down and it's safe to fire up kind of secondary data centers. And then slowing down, really. So we had a lot happening in the evening of October the 11th, and by being a little more cautious and thoughtful, some of the ways we switched over from data center 1 to data center 2 could have been much more clinical and thought out and reviewed by the team. So that again is a learning. We've got pretty comprehensive processes, but they didn't capture this situation, and people were moving at speed. And again, we've got some process changes there which have helped us. Jaydeep, can I call on you to kind of cover off the last couple of points?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Rajesh. I think the only things I'd really like to add to your summary is that we are very worried, as everyone was very worried in the evening, is that ultimately about how a staker's feeling who are using the protocol and want to feel confident and safe. And I think that what this incident report hasn't done, and what we aren't able to show, is how within 2 minutes of the event, 20 people were on a global call, and the processes, the tooling, the people, the commitment to getting this right and fixing this, and supporting a newish node operator like us coming on was incredible. And so the confidence that you could perhaps, as a silver lining, take from this event that a staker could have, that there is the highest levels of tooling, process, and people in the protocol, is something that's difficult to capture in that incident report, and it's not as quantitative, but it's really important and powerful. And thank you to the community. We had other node operators offering us assistance. We had obviously the people who were part of the response team, but it really was a case of warm hands, holding us through it the whole way through, for which we're very grateful.
Perfect. I see a couple of questions in terms of would we share our upcoming infrastructure improvements, and absolutely, we'd be very happy to. And secondly, there's been talk again on the forums about how can we support new operators in particular, but also all operators with onboarding procedures and processes which really help them out, and we think there's a lot that can be done there. I think we'd be very happy to kind of participate in those types of programs and learn from the best and share what we know. So yeah, very keen to make that happen. Izzy, am I handing back to you?
I think we can definitely go to questions. So I see that Sven already has one question. I think it's broadly directed to both you and JD from your perspective, but perhaps to the wider node operator audience. So Sven's asking, is there anything else that we could do as contributors in the way that we set up onboarding procedures in order to help future onboarders prevent similar issues?
Yeah. Sorry, JD, do you want to take that?
No, I go for it. You can start. I mean, I think it's just a bit early at the moment for us to be having definitive answers to that. Is my view, Rajesh. I don't know if you disagree.
Yeah, I think there are definitely some kind of checklists and onboarding guides that are very simplistic that could be provided to folks. I mean, we're all professional node operators. We have been doing this for a while, but it always helps to have an external perspective and some input, particularly if you're very close to your own infrastructure. So I think certainly we could do things there. The other piece, though, is part of the beauty of the Lido system is that every operator operates differently. They run different clients, they run in different geographies, they've got different processes, and if it was all borged into one, very similar infrastructure, I think a lot of the robustness of the protocol disappears. So I love the fact that we have such diversity across node operators, but clearly there are some principles there that should be best practice globally, and I think maybe we can distill that out in the coming months.
Yeah, from my perspective, that also makes sense. I think one of the key things that we as at least as contributors are trying to do and how we're approaching this is that like we don't want to be like you say, come up with like a centralized list of procedures or mechanisms or processes that are like the go-to standard, because if you create only one standard and everybody's using that standard, it does lead to a loss of robustness. And it's difficult to come up with or to go about cataloging all the different ways that people may be approaching the problem and making sure that if you codify this, it's done in a way where there's like consistency and quality. An appropriate way to right size, let's say, the guidance or the advice, depending on the size of the node operator, where they're operating out of, and what kind of context and environment they're dealing with, as well as the infrastructure setup. But also to prevent, let's say, like the DAO or the contributors of the DAO from being a kind of central choke point or a gateway for this information. We want to try to find a way to do it such that the node operators basically create, amplify, maintain, and spread this knowledge and this guidance, and so that it comes out like from the edges, as opposed to it coming out centrally and getting pushed out. So what we're trying to do is think about what kind of mechanisms can you put in place to like foster and cultivate that kind of, let's say, knowledge sharing, especially in an industry which is still kind of in the space of like co-opetition. It hasn't gotten to the point where it's very, very strictly competitive. But the truth is that like developing this knowledge, developing this expertise and these best practices basically is tantamount to what is the competitive advantage of all of the different node operators in the space, right? So it's a little bit difficult to get everybody to play nice with each other all at the same time, because there's like a difference between how node operators cooperate through the usage of the Lido protocol, which is kind of like almost a collective, and how they operate with within like the rest of the industry. But we have a couple of ideas on that, and we're going to be putting forth those ideas on the forum, and hopefully it'll make sense and it'll be appealing both for node operators and for the community.
Amazing, thank you.
I did have one specific question here. If we can go back to the analysis of the original incident, and if anybody else, any of the other node operators on the call have any questions, please feel free to put up your hand or ask in the chat. So if you can go to the network diagram, please. So in the architecture overview, so we're basically saying that in the Web3 signer environment, if I remember correctly, slashing protection was disabled in the original setup.
Yeah, that, absolutely. So yes, you're absolutely right. This was without slashing protection in DC3 originally. It's now got it.
Okay, so this is the updated diagram basically, and one of the differentiations or one of the improvements that you guys have made is that the slashing protection is now explicitly enabled such that when you're using the Web3 standard to kind of be like a switch or like like a rail switch, like in terms of train tracks, you have the slashing protection database there to enforce and also make sure in an augment of other mechanisms, right? So you can use things like firewall rules or VPNs or things like that, to also limit the network traffic.
Yes, correct.
Okay, great. I also have a message, and I see that we're live on YouTube. I don't know if we're echoing or not. If so, we can just turn it into a concert, I guess, on YouTube. So that means we'll pick up the way that we're running through the show a little bit more formally, and make sure that we're transitioning appropriately between the different segments. So as we just for the viewers listening on the stream. Basically, we went through the first segment already, which was LaunchNodes presenting the status update on the slashing incident. And we just covered 2 questions, one from myself and one from Sven. And we're currently just taking a look to see if there's any comments on the chat or any hands raised, but I don't see any. In which case, I propose that we move on to the next segment. And so thank you very much, both Rajesh and Jaideep. And as you guys are formalizing and putting the finishing touches on the next steps of the remediation plan, we're all looking forward to discussing that in public on the forums sometime in the next couple weeks.
Fantastic. Thanks, Izzy. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much.